Hello and welcome to the Shepheard-Walwyn podcast series. My name is Jonathan Brown. Shepheard-Walwyn is a campaigning book publisher based in London, England. Our purpose is to uncover and promote new ideas to society's oldest problems. And whilst our specialty is ethical economics, something Anthony Werner, our driving force for over 40 years, has pioneered, we have branched out over the years to other related areas such as the environment and the lives and works of society's change agents. These podcasts promote ideas we're convinced can actually help us build a better society for all of us. So have a listen and be sure to share with your friends if you like them, but also tell us what you think. These are debates we all need to be part of. So without further ado, let's get into the interview. Hello and welcome back to the podcast. My name's Jonathan Brown. Today I'm speaking with Dom Frisby, perhaps the world's first economic commentator and comedian. Dom has been a friend of SW and PSE for a long time, hosting talks with Phil, but also he was crucial to the superb documentary, The Four Horsemen, something we know our readers and subscribers have enjoyed over the years. A short time ago, we interviewed Dom to look at all his work, and whilst he isn't an SW author, we think his work is worth the time to look at, as he also has an interesting perspective on precious metals, crypto, the markets in general, and also political systems. In this first podcast, we look at how Dom became the world's first economist-investor-comedian, how he became a libertarian. This section is subtitled, Why Cuban Fathers Want Their Daughters to be Prostitutes. And we also look at how well-intended government actions can undermine and even eliminate personal responsibility of the citizens they are trying to help. We then finish off with the importance of 1907 to the First World War, and also why people of every political persuasion hate the BBC. Dom, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for inviting me.
It seems quite a while since we were first talking about doing it. I just wondered, just for the audience, I know most of our readers and listeners will know about you, but if you just give us a quick background as to how you became the world's first economist-investor-comedian.
Well, I don't know if I am the world's first, because I described that, I call myself that on the, I think somewhere in one of a biography somewhere it says the world's only financial writer and comedian. But I was doing Edinburgh, and some German guy came up to me and said, "Oh, I'm a financial writer and comedian too." So there is another guy out there in Germany rivaling me. But I went to university after school, like most people do, and I was pretty sure I wanted to be a writer of some kind. My dad was a writer, and I thought I wanted to be a writer. I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to write, but I had an idea I wanted to travel. And then I looked at all the writers, who I thought were the best writers, William Shakespeare and Charles Dickens and people like that. And they'd all started out as actors. And so I thought, I should go and start out as an actor in order to be a writer. And maybe you need to start out as an actor to know how actors think and so on in order to be able to write for them. And so I was doing that thing in my early 20s where I wasn't really sure what I was doing. But anyway, I went to Webber Douglas Drama School. And I guess I lost my way a bit, because when I was at drama school, I think I lost sight of the writing. And it turned out I was the best in the year at radio. I don't know why, but I always thought I was an okay actor, but I don't think the teachers ever thought that much of me. But I was just good at radio. And when I left drama school, as I was leaving, in those days, it was cassettes. And I sent a cassette around all the voiceover agents in London. And one of them signed me up. And within a week, I had my first voiceover job within a week of leaving drama school. And it was a 1-year contract. And it was paying £280 once a week to voice a program on Channel 4. And you were really well treated, and it was reasonably good money. And so I would do acting jobs and things, but I just never was successful as quickly as I was doing voiceovers. And so I just found myself as a voiceover artist. And, there just aren't many young blokes, or there weren't at that time, doing it. And there was a lot of demand for young voices. I remember one of my first big advertising campaigns was the Nintendo 64. And I guess they wanted a young bloke to be the voice of that for obvious reasons, because young blokes are the market. And so this is in the 90s. And then I went to, while I was doing voiceovers, I wrote this act, stand-up act, called the Upper Class Rapper. And I had this idea that I wanted to release it as a Christmas novelty single. It was a comic song. It wasn't a stand-up actor. It was a comic song. And I was at university with a bloke who'd gone on and become a music agent. So I phoned him up and I said, I've got this novelty song that I think would be quite a good Christmas novelty single. In those days, there would always be Christmas novelty singles that got into the top 10 and stuff. And he said, I'll go and do it in my brother's club. And his brother was a bloke called Malcolm Hardy, who's a sort of legend in comedy, who had a club in southeast London, very rough, famously rough club. And I went to the open spot night to do an open spot. And everyone was just getting booed off. And in those days, if you did well, you got given a paid booking straight away. And my set went really well. And so the following week, I got a half spot, a paid booking. So my second ever gig was a paid booking. And then that went really well. And they were like, look, we can't give you a paid 20 straight away because you don't have the experience, but we'll give you another paid half spot. And I'll phone up a few other clubs in London and get you booked there. And just suddenly I found myself as a stand-up comic. And voiceovers and stand-up comedy, you can do both. You can go and do gigs in the evening and voiceovers in the day. So I found myself doing that. And now we're in the early noughties. Voiceovers is also quite a well-paid job, or it was back then. It's not so much now. And I just found myself with some money. And then I'd got divorced and I had a bit of money and I wanted to invest it. And one thing that had always baffled me was why house prices are so expensive. I could never understand why a house was so expensive when it was built 150 years ago in most cases. And, people didn't earn as much as house prices cost, and I couldn't understand it. And then I was working out how to invest the money, and I was just reading stuff on the internet late at night, and I stumbled across all this stuff about gold and investing in gold and money and so on. And I thought, oh, this is really interesting. I like this. This is a story that I intuitively understand. And I think what I was slowly discovering was basically Austrian economics, which is the sort of most natural, intuitive form of economics. It just makes sense on a basic level. And there were all these really interesting people talking, Jim Rogers and James Turk and all these guys. And I was like, I'd like to interview these people and find out more. And also, I'd like to get financial advice from them, but I don't want to have to pay for it. So I started a podcast, a bit like yourself. Many people have done it since. I started a podcast as an excuse to meet these people. And what I discovered was how happy, particularly back then, people were to do interviews and give their time. I guess they're promoting their own brand. And just the podcast was really popular. It was an investment podcast. It was one of the first ever podcasts, I suppose, called Commodity Watch Radio. What a name. And it was just really popular. And one of the people I interviewed was a lady called Merrin Somerset Webb, who writes for MoneyWeek and the FT. And she said, oh, we need people like you to come and write for us at MoneyWeek. And I was like, well, I don't know anything about money. And she was, no, it's fine. Just come and write for us. And so I had a column for MoneyWeek. And here I am 15 years later, I'm still writing the same weekly column on their website. I suppose you call it a weekly blog. And what I discovered is one of the disciplines of comedy is you have to speak. If the audience doesn't understand what you're saying, they don't laugh. So that imposes the discipline of clarity onto the comedian. And so I think I brought that into writing about finance. I was always very clear. And a lot of people who write about finance always obfuscate a lot. Alan Greenspan called it purposeful obfuscation. And so my column was reasonably popular. I was writing about gold and gold miners and commodities, and they were in a bull market at the time. And so the wind was with me and everything went pretty well. And so that's how I ended up with this weird double life as a financial writer and comedian. And it sort of works. It shouldn't do, but it kind of works. And that's how I am where I am today.
And did the libertarian views come from your reading of the Austrian economist then?
I didn't really. I don't think I actually read that much. I've read bits of von Mises and I read a lot of Murray Rothbard and Milton Friedman and so on. Milton Friedman's, I suppose you call him an Austrian, sort of. And the I mean, the problem with gold is because gold is money, or was money, depending on what your definition of money is. It's a very political metal, and it's probably the most political investment you can make, or it was before Bitcoin came along. And if you're investing in it, you start to read about the politics of small government and individual responsibility and low taxes and not debasing the currency and all that kind of stuff. And so I wouldn't say gold turned me into a libertarian, but gold helped me discover that I am a libertarian.
And I think the theme that runs through all your work is that the importance of sound money, and also not laissez-faire government, but the smallest government possible. Yeah,
I mean, I'm a bit inconsistent, because if I go to a couple of gold conferences or a Bitcoin conference or something, I'll come out of it just going, I want to be an anarcho-capitalist, zero government, but probably in practical terms, 10 or 15% of GDP is more practical. Certainly where we have nation states.
So your first book was Life After the State. Is that right?
Yeah.
And you start off. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I wrote that. I wrote a film, or I co-wrote a film called Four Horsemen, which was very popular film, all about the global economy. But the guy I wrote it with, we had a big falling out because nobody who worked on the film got paid, and he didn't credit me properly, or at least I felt he didn't credit me properly. And so there was a big falling out, but the film was extraordinarily popular. I think it's had 9 or 10 million views on YouTube. And it just showed me, the experience showed me that you don't need to be a famous economist to write about economics and big stuff. And so that led me into Life After the State. I knew I could write about big stuff without having a degree at Oxford in economics or anything, in PPE or something.
It's a very popular film for, it's just under 10 million on the main site.
How much? 10 million?
Just under 10 million, 9.5 million. Yeah. Is it normally double? Is that you get the official views and then you get the people steal it and then put it on their own site and stuff?
Yeah, and it was broadcast on TV, on a few TV channels, and I guess it's on Facebook as well, and other, what's that one called? BitChute or whatever, it'll be on other platforms as well.
Yeah. And it's a great, it's a great film. So that then led you to Life After the State, and somewhat amusingly, I think you start the book with why every Cuban father wanted his daughter to be a hooker. I just wondered if you could take us through some of your adventures in South America and what that really is about.
Yeah, one of the guys who helped me edit it was like encouraged me to write provocative chapter titles and tell stories rather than just philosophize. And but in the early 90s, it would have been probably 94, something like that. I said at the beginning of the interview I wanted to travel a lot, and but I'd also felt by the time I'd finished my studies that it was time to work and take life seriously. And so I sort of did a deal with myself, which was that I would work, but every year on Boxing Day, I would go away and I would come back at the end of January. So I would effectively have 5 or 6 weeks travel. Nothing much happened in January. So in effect, I only missed a week or two of work. And I was in love with Latin America. So I went to Colombia one year, Cuba another year, Bolivia another year, Guatemala and Honduras another year, all these wonderful places. And I was really into Latin dancing, salsa music. And so I was really excited to go to Cuba, which was the home of it. And I had deluded ideas from university about what socialism and communism and being left-wing meant. And I thought when I went to Cuba, I'd be going to somewhere with beaches like you get in Thailand and delicious exotic food and beautiful women and beautiful people and listening to amazing music and drinking rum and coke and exotic cocktails and all the rest of it. And I got there and it was the most depressing country. It was like Havana was just falling apart, and it needed the whole thing needed a facelift. And I'd just never seen poverty like it. I'd been to India and I'd been to North Africa and stuff, but it was a different sort of poverty, because, and I've been all across northern Thailand, which at the time was very poor too. But this Cuban thing was like literally nobody had any money, and you couldn't, even if you had money, Cuban money I'm talking about, you couldn't buy anything. There just wasn't stuff available to buy. And the only time you could buy anything was in these these government-run shops, which would only accept US dollars. And I was like, how can you have the Cuban government, which is, hates America, running these government supermarkets where you only accept US dollars? And the only stuff you could buy with Cuban pesos was like ice cream and pizza. And it wasn't nice ice, Western ice cream. And, you'd have this famously brilliant education system, but nobody had pens or paper. And you have this famously brilliant healthcare, but nobody had medicines or syringes or anything like that. So what's the point? And you'd have like these highly qualified people, a brilliant engineer or a brilliant doctor. And I'm gonna get the numbers wrong now because it's so long since I was there. But my recollection is they'd earn like $20 a month, but they'd be paid that in Cuban pesos. They wouldn't be paid that in US dollars. And you couldn't buy anything with Cuban pesos. And the official exchange rate was 1 peso to $1, but there was a sort of unofficial exchange rate, which was 20 pesos to $1. And just everyone wanted US dollars because it was the only way you could buy anything like clothes or, a pair of jeans. You could not buy a pair of jeans with Cuban pesos or meat, anything that we just totally take for granted. You could only get with US dollars. So you had this situation where for some reason there were loads of Italians going there, and you'd have these really beautiful, handsome, well-dressed Italian men who'd like cop off with a Cuban girl, or the Cuban girl would cop off with the Italian. I'm not quite sure which way around it was. And so you had these sort of mixed race couples walking around, and there were basically loads of people who were treating Cuba as it was sex tourism. And the only way that Cubans could get dollars was via tourists. And the easiest way to get the dollars off the tourists was to shag them or to give them a lift, taxis. So basically, everyone wanted to be either a hooker or a taxi driver or a waiter. Any way you could get, didn't matter if you had a PhD in nuclear science or whatever, you had no access to Westerners. So you got this situation where the demographic that was the uneducated girl, usually a black girl in her late teens or early 20s, was earning more money than anyone else. And a girl could earn in a night, I don't know, $100 or something, or $200, whatever, sleeping with a tourist. And she would become the girlfriend of that tourist while he was there. And often they would try and marry him and get out of the country. But that was the way you got your dollars. And so that's why I came up with that title, Why Every Cuban Father Wanted His Daughter to Be a Hooker. And I was staying with this family when I was out there, and the father, I forget what he did. He was some kind of engineer, and he just explained that whole dynamic. I mean, I saw it with my own eyes, but he explained it. I want my daughter to be a hooker because that's how I get her dollars. Now, I think when Castro overthrew the previous regime, he's the revolutionaries, and he was mates with the Che Guevara, who taught him about communism, and they overthrew the horrible Americans and the horrible capitalist regime and all the rest of it. And Cuba's always been America's playground. All the villains, took their alcohol money from the 20s and built casinos and so on in Cuba. So it was always a bit sex touristy anyway, and sleazy, and America's playground and so on. People would go to Cuba to do stuff they couldn't do in America. But, you know, you saw in Havana the sheer might or the wealth that had once been in Cuba. You could just see by the buildings and the scale of the buildings how much wealth had once been there. But it had all fallen apart since the revolution. And I'm sure Castro went in with the highest ideals. And then the only way he could make his plans work after America cut him off, after the revolution, after the sanctions and so on, was to ally himself with Russia. And of course, Russia was delighted to have an ally right on America's doorstep. At the height of the Cold War, that would have, you know, really wound up America, and it did. So Russia would give Cuba essentials. And you had this bizarre situation where you had these huge American vehicles from the early 1950s before the regime, these huge cars like you see in Back to the Future. And then all these larders, these Russian larders. And it was just this weird kind of contrast of the two vehicles and nothing in between. And so Russia would bail out Cuba with essential supplies. But because they were all administered and distributed by government, you know, what they weren't allocated in the same way that they would be in a free market. But as I say, I'm sure Castro went in with the highest ideals. And if you'd said to Castro, if you overthrow this regime, you are going to create an imbalanced society where proper education is not rewarded and everyone is going to incentivize to send their daughters into prostitution. Is that what you really want? I'm sure he would have said no. But the unintended consequence of all the high goals and the lofty goals of the revolution was to create this society where every Cuban father wanted his daughter to be a hooker. And there's a wonderful metaphor in there for the unintended consequences of government action that intends good things to happen and gets something very, very different.
And I know in I don't know if it's daylight robbery or life after the state, when you talk about when there was the introduction of national insurance and which eliminated the friendly societies.
Yeah, the friendly societies, when people go, you know, people forget that the welfare state is a relatively new invention. You know, I think it was only called the welfare state after World War II, but it's kind of started with the National Insurance Act, which was, you know, between 1907 and 1911, there was a series of acts, David Lloyd George and Churchill. And before then, welfare and education, to a certain extent, education was a bit earlier than other forms of welfare, late 19th century, but education and welfare and healthcare and all these things were not provided by government. They were provided by the church, and in the 19th century, what were called the friendly societies, the cooperative societies. And in the context of the time, they worked really well. And they happened organically. You know, human beings have a basic need to provide each other with welfare. They don't want to see other human beings in times of need going hard off. You know, it's a basic human instinct to want to help each other. And obviously that varies in different degrees with different human beings. And to meet this need, with the increased wealth of the 19th century, the friendly societies emerged. And so, for example, you would have it might be a community built around some workers or an area or whatever. And they would employ the local doctor, for example. And the doctor would be directly accountable to the parents, to the patients, and to his employers, which was the friendly society. And they had insurance, you know, mutual insurance. And the beauty of it is that they were much smaller than state-sponsored welfare. And there was much more, like, you know, different forms of welfare require different treatments. One guy might need an arm around his shoulder and another guy might need a kick up the backside. Whereas one size all state welfare, where you just get given a certain amount of money and that's it, doesn't have that flexibility. Whereas you could get that kind of thing. And they were so successful, the friendly societies, but there was still like a bottom 3, 4, 5% that slipped through the net. And with all the increased wealth, and the Victorians were, of course, great philanthropists, great charity. They really grew this thing of wanting to help our fellow man. When I look through at the British people, I think the Victorian, it was the Victorians who outlawed slavery. They were just, I think when I look at British history, I just think the Victorians were the greatest people that we've ever produced. And obviously they're the same people that we are now, or in a lot of us are now, but in the context of the times and what they did and what they achieved, you just look at the buildings they built and the things they did, and the wage growth all through the 19th century, and how, at the beginning of the 19th century, most people were illiterate, and by about 3/4 of the way through, everyone could read and write, bar a few exceptions. Literacy levels were not far off what they are today by about 1870, when education became compulsory. They were just a phenomenal people, and they built stuff. They thought like people at the top of an empire, and they thought, we're going to build stuff that's not just, a profit over 5 years. We're going to build stuff that's going to last forever, because we are a great people and we want to leave our legacy. We can't build stuff today that's like what the Victorians built. I'm living in a Victorian house. It was built for a railway worker in 90 something. And it's 100 years, 130 years later, it's still standing. And it's a railway worker couldn't even afford one room in this house. Anyway, so the friendly societies were so successful that David Lloyd George and Winston Churchill wanted to replicate them at the national level. So they bought in the national insurance, and ordinary workers couldn't afford or didn't want to pay their insurance twice. Why would you pay the national insurance and pay your local insurance when they're both giving you the same service? You don't pay for it twice. So because national insurance was compulsory, they had to pay that. And the unintended consequence of national insurance, which was to replicate the friendly societies, was that it put them all out of business. And it was a tiny thing. It was just a tiny, tiny thing between 1907 and 1911. And then it just got bigger. It was the first hole in the dam. And then it just got bigger and bigger. And the First World War came along, and then there was all those deaths. And then they had to make everything good after the First World War, and look after the families who'd lost loved ones, look after the wounded soldiers, and so on. And just welfare grew and grew and grew. And as it grew, the state grew and taxes grew. And we've never looked back. It's never stopped growing ever since.
You certainly, looking at your work and other stuff as well, there's a period around that time, like you say, like, I guess, was it 1909, the People's Budget, or and then
they called it the People's Budget.
And then you got the the creation of the Fed in America in 1913, and then we get into the First World War, and then the UK, Britain, comes off the gold standard. And as you say in your work, they had to print the money. They had to come off gold so they could print more money, and then pretend that they hadn't. So they tried to go back onto the gold standard as well. But it was that just extraordinary explosion that you write about of income tax, of other charges and everything else. And also just the state doing more and interfering more and more in people's lives.
Like, if I was to pinpoint the point at which everything went wrong, sometimes I think it's the People's Budget, the National Insurance Acts. And sometimes I just think it was World War One. World War One, there were so many people who, you mentioned the foundation of the Fed in America. The other thing they got in 1913 was income tax for the first time, although that's slightly more complicated. But here, there were just loads of people who started paying income tax for the first time in World War One because of the higher rates and the lower thresholds. And the pattern with a government in crisis is very common, and it repeats itself. And this is something I talk about in Daylight Robbery. When there's some kind of crisis, government is able to do things when there's a crisis that it would not normally be able to do in peacetime. So especially raise taxes. And so, for example, 2008, if they'd come along and said, we've got this idea for quantitative easing before there was a financial crisis, they would never have been allowed to do it. Similarly, a lot of the COVID stuff, all the higher taxes in World War One and World War Two, without the crisis of that war, those new measures wouldn't have been able to exist. It wouldn't have been allowed. But, you know, the people wouldn't have accepted it. But they get introduced with the crisis. And then after the crisis has passed, things never go back to what they were before the crisis began. Quantitative easing is now normal. You know, I think just today, the government's going to buy over £1 billion worth. It's that stuff gets introduced in the crisis, and after the crisis is passed, it never goes back to what it was. Even the Institute of Fiscal Studies admits this happens, and they call it the ratchet effect. And so with each crisis, government grows. You look at COVID today, just governments everywhere in a way that it just never was.
Yeah, and again, and also as well is demonstrating that if you don't agree with them, then you get yourself a whole lot of trouble. Right?
There's no, you know, you can't deny that anyone who's dissented about the received wisdom on COVID, or the received wisdom on masks, or the received wisdom on vaccines, you know, has been ostracized and in many cases cancelled and removed. Therefore, you know, even with the apparently free market that is tech, we've learned that it's just not that free, and there's some kind of unholy alliance between government and tech behind the scenes. But any dissenting voices have been suppressed or cancelled. And on mainstream telly, there's a narrative, and you don't see the other side of the narrative. And those who are on the other side of the narrative are nutters or cranks or anti-vaxxers or whatever. And they've been cancelled basically, or suppressed.
And some of watching your show, was it back in October when you did the show in was it October, November?
At the backyard?
Yeah.
I think it was early November, yeah.
Right. And
good night, that wasn't it?
Oh, it was phenomenal. It really was just great stuff, and also just a fantastic audience.
Yeah, the audience were great.
And just some of the stuff you there. And I know if people haven't seen your comedy stuff, they've just seen your economics, they really need to listen to some of your songs and stuff, and your comments are very funny. One of the things that surprised me as well, just on a slight detour, was I remember the BBC getting one of the biggest, when you were telling about maybe the Maybe song, and you said maybe the BBC didn't have the right, you know, and that had I remember that having the biggest cheer about the BBC's errors and the way that's gone.
It's really funny because in the culture war, the one thing that unites left and right, and the centre doesn't agree, but is a loathing of the BBC. The model is out of date. It's not fit for the times. We don't need state-supplied TV anymore. The reasons for the BBC to exist have gone. We don't need state media. You know, our entertainment needs are met perfectly well by the internet and Netflix and Disney and all those other channels. You know, we just don't need it. And our oral needs, we don't need BBC radio because we've got podcasts. We don't need the weather and the news because there's infinite supplies of both. And it's just a model for another time, if indeed it was ever appropriate. But the left think the BBC is biased to the right, and the right think the BBC is biased to the left, and the frustration with it is universal. And so, like, I do that song, the Maybe song, and there's just certain subjects I can only do it in certain rooms, you know, depending on what the room thinks. But the BBC there is a national communal frustration with it. And again, most people who work in the BBC are well-intentioned, and the goals of the BBC were well-intentioned. Martin Durkin is very good on this, the documentary maker, but he talks about the reason the BBC was formed in the first place came with the invention of radio. And the government were really concerned about this new medium, radio, and the possibilities of radio, and they wanted to control it. They didn't want dissenting voices to all have their thing on radio. So the reason the BBC existed was to control this new medium of radio. And anyway, that's by the by. But I've just done a pilot for the BBC, and I pray to God that they commission it, because it is literally, even with everything that's going on, if you're a comedian, it is still the best platform there is. It's just a fantastic platform. And so you'll get a lot of actors and comedians and people like that defending it. But that's because they're the ones who are lucky enough to be on the platform.
Yeah.
But in terms of, I just think my attitude is make it voluntary. And then you just solve everything. If you want to subscribe, you can. And if you don't want to, you don't have to. And there we go. I mean, I buy it because I watch Match of the Day most weeks. I can't stand the Gary Lineker and the panel, but I like watching my weekly football highlights. But then again, I can just as easily watch them on the internet. So yeah, that's my stance. But yeah, dissatisfaction with the BBC is commonly felt on both sides of the culture war.
Thanks for listening to the first part in this interview with Dom Frisby. For more information, you can check out the links on his content below, his YouTube channels and his new investor subscription service, and also check out the other episodes when they're released. Until next time, keep reading. Thank you for listening to the Shepheard-Walwyn podcast. To explore these ideas further, be sure to visit our website www.shepheard-walwyn.com and join our mailing list for news and special offers. Check out our authors and buy the books to learn more. And you can also find us on social media. Links are also on the website. And if you like the podcast, please head over to iTunes or Spotify to give us a review. It's surprisingly helpful in getting the ideas out there. So until next time, keep reading